Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another exciting episode of General Biology. Today, we're going to talk about how species interact with each other and how to restore an area to bring back more species. So, here's a typical Florida scene: you have a water body, a lake, a pond, and a whole slew of water birds on there. You got some egrets, you got some herons, some spoonbills, some ibis, and all of these birds kind of look alike. They're all tall birds, they all have long bills, they obviously like the edge of the water. So, a big question is, if competition is a real thing, then how can you have so many species that look alike living in the same area like you do here? Well, the answer is you don't have competition, or at least you try to minimize competition. All of these birds have distinct characteristics, and each species differs in how tall they are, how long their bills are, the shape of their bills, and the areas of the water that they like to forage in. As a result, they all try to minimize their direct competition with each other. And in doing so, they can inhabit the same area, occupying all of these different niches throughout that environment. So, competition can be divided into two types: interspecific competition and intraspecific competition. Now, intraspecific competition is the competition that occurs within a species. So, animals having territoriality, for example, they're competing for access to a resource, whether it's food or mating opportunities, and that's competition that occurs within a species. But often when we think about competition, we think about competition between species or interspecific competition. And this happens when you have a resource that is available for some and not for others, and it ends up setting up a situation where they have to try and oust each other with certain advantages to gain access to a resource that is in short supply. So here is a famous experiment demonstrating competition between two species of barnacles. These barnacles, Calamus barnacles and Balanus barnacles, inhabit different areas relative to the tide. So you have the Calamus barnacles inhabiting high tide areas. This is the place where they get frequently left high and dry, so to speak. And then you have the Balanus barnacles, which tend to inhabit lower tide areas in places where they're getting more frequent access to the seawater, right? Barnacles are filter feeders. So the experiment was really simple. You had these two living side by side, literally side by side. What happens when you remove one of them? Well, when they removed the Balanus barnacles, well, what happened was over a certain amount of time, the Thalamus barnacles started to inhabit those low tide areas. So, what is being demonstrated here? Well, it's straightforward, really. Basically, they were in competition with each other, and Balanus happened to outdo the Thalamus barnacles by just a certain amount under those low tide conditions. So they were always able to edge them out. But it wasn't that the Calamus barnacles couldn't inhabit that area, they just didn't. So this is demonstrating two fundamental things, or two things anyway, types of niches. You have the realized niche, which is the environment and the role that an organism plays in their environment that you actually see out in nature under natural conditions. And then something called the fundamental niche, which is what that organism is capable of doing if competition was not a factor. So in the Thalamus barnacle, the realized niche was up in the high tide area when Balanus was around. But as soon as Balanus was removed, well, now it could occupy the full range of habitat that it's allowed to, its fundamental niche. So this is a classic experiment demonstrating competition in nature, which is actually a surprisingly difficult thing to demonstrate and often involves this kind of removal type experiment. Now what happens is, in the end, you have a situation where no two species can occupy the exact same niche. And a niche is how you interact with your environment on every possible front. The places you live, the food that you eat, the places you make your nests, the timing of when you breed, all of these things. No two species are exactly alike in this regard. They always have to differ in some respect. So whenever two species are living in the same environment, they cannot compete for every limiting resource, right? And if they did, basically one would be favored over the other. And this is what they call competitive exclusion. So whenever you have species that are similar living in the same environment, you see this tendency to take over different niches. Or whenever they're living in the same place, they're going to use an environment in slightly different ways, right? And whenever they live in the same place, we use the term sympatric to describe their ranges. So here's another classic example. These are warblers that are breeding up in northern Canada. These are migratory birds. They show up in northern Canada right around the time the snows thaw away, and they're basically nesting. And this shows on a typical conifer tree where these different species of otherwise very similar little songbirds are going to make their nests. So even though they're living in the same place and they're using the same tree for nest sites, they're going to occupy different areas of the tree to make their nest. So this is an example of niche separation based on this principle of competitive exclusion. So now here's another famous example. These are finches from the Galapagos, and these are 3 islands, Los Hermanos, Daphne, and Santa Maria. And there's 2 species. On Los Hermanos and on Daphne, they're living allopatrically, meaning that the species that's found there is living by itself. But on Santa Maria, they live sympatrically, meaning that they live together. So this is some data showing beak depth against it's what they call a frequency distribution. They're showing the depth of the beak, the size of the beak, as is shown there, and how many individuals would fit into that group based on beak depth. So what do you think is happening here? Well, hopefully the more astute among you would have picked up on the fact that on the islands where they're living by themselves, they have a certain range of beak depths, right? And this is probably tailored to those specific conditions of those islands in the Galapagos. Each island is a little bit different in a lot of ways, in terms of the environments and the plants and the food available and the seeds and that sort of thing. But when they live together on Santa Maria or on San Cristobal, well, now those beak depths are starting to diverge, right? So the fuliginosa bird is starting to get a smaller beak, right? It's lower beak depths, right? And then the fortis bird is going to shift towards larger beak depths. So you see this shift in the average. They're basically trying to avoid competition with each other. Now on the other islands, their beak depths pretty much overlap. So again, competitive exclusion driving differences in traits. So before the previous example with the warblers would be an example of partitioning of resources, right? Resource partitioning. So they're using different parts of the tree because they have the same resource, but they're using it in slightly different ways. The example with the finches is an example of what they call character displacement. Competition driving the evolution of a character by favoring the character in different directions depending on the species. This is happening when these species are forced to compete sympatrically. When they're allopatric and they're living by themselves in their environment, they can inhabit their fundamental niche. But when they're living together, they have to make the adjustments in order to minimize competition when they're living sympatrically, and you start seeing more of a realized niche. So that's interspecific competition in a nutshell. And you see this all over nature. So here again, this is an example with, and here in Florida, we got the brown anole. The brown anole is what we consider a trunk anole, meaning that you tend to see them on the trunks of trees. Very simple. If you go to any of the islands in the Caribbean, you'll get different species, but they all tend to fall into these different ecotypes or morphs. So you always have a trunk anole. You have an anole that specializes on shrubbery and bushes. You have a larger anole that tends to specialize in living up high in the canopy. And then you have anoles that tend to associate with grasses, right? So they're not actually on the tree. Again, Different species in different islands, but they all evolve in these different directions. Why? Because they're trying to inhabit the same place. Right? So in this example, you have four species of anoles. They're each occupying their space and they're minimizing competition with each other. So when competition does occur, what you tend to see is the weaker of the two, i.e., the one less able to use its environment, start to contract its niche and how it uses its resources. So a strong competitor may or may not change much, or it might even take over new places. A weak competitor tends to see a decrease in particular, going from its fundamental niche to its realized niche. And this could be a problem. And this picture right here below kind of shows the problem. This picture is a little bit misleading because the big green anole is actually the species that would be considered the weaker competitor of the two, but it's the native anole found here in the southeastern United States. The invasive anole is the brown anole. They're shown there with the red dewlap. And the brown anole is from the Bahamas, from Cuba, and it's been introduced into Florida and other places, and it's basically spread into the green anole's habitat. And it's the green anole that's had to make the adjustments. So it's no longer considered a trunk ground anole. It's starting to occupy places that it didn't occupy before. Shrubbery, canopy started to become more of an arboreal lizard in places where the brown anole is found. So this is an example where an invasive species is forcing a native species to change. So again, you can't coexist as competitors for everything. So you're going to have to make adjustments when other species are found. So again, all species have a range of environmental conditions with which they can just go all out. And that's the fundamental niche. If they're living by themselves with no competition, that's what you would see. But when other species are present that are also using the environment in the same or similar ways, you're going to see a shift from a fundamental niche to the realized niche, again, trying to separate itself from others. So what's an environmental issue where you see this framework be particularly important? I actually just mentioned it, invasive species. Invasive species often are living their realized niche in their native habitat, in their native range, in their native countries, but when they're introduced to a brand new place that's not ready for them, they go gangbusters and start to inhabit everything in their fundamental niche. In the absence of predators, in the absence of competitors that evolved to cope with them, and they can therefore just start occupying all these new environments that you wouldn't see in their native place. And that's the big issue with invasive species. So when we talk about how species interact, we often use this approach of defining things as either being a positive effect on one species, a negative effect on a species, or in rare cases where we don't tend to see any effect. And there's a lot of debate about whether this is even a thing, but it could depend on what we see. It could depend on what we look at as far as the competition goes. So for example, here are two plants competing for light. So they're going to compete above ground. right? So they might spread their leaves in certain directions, try to overtake the other, try to outgrow each other. That's light competition. However, if you're competing for nutrients, that competition would be below ground, right? You don't see much happening up at the top, but you'll see roots trying to outdo each other, right? Trying to invade each other's space. So, depending on what resource you're interested in, you need to accurately define that before you could start assigning things like a positive effect, a negative effect, or no discernible effect. Right? So a lot of these are going to make a lot of sense. So we'll hopefully just be able to breeze right through them. Let's start with the most obvious one, right? Predation. Whenever predation happens, like this little seal being, looks like it might just escape, there's being attacked by a shark. Well, predation obviously has when it happens, a clear winner and a clear loser. Positive effect on the predator, negative effect on the prey. Of course, predation is super important in terms of driving behavior, in terms of driving evolution. You think about how predators are armed in order to be able to take down their prey, right, with various means, whether it's teeth, claws, whatever. And at the same time, prey are also co-evolving in terms of changing their behavior, having horns, antlers, that sort of thing, right? Various things to sort of protect themselves. Could be thorns on a plant, could be anything, right? So predation has a clear positive negative relationship, and note the notation here: positive / negative, right? That's basically showing the relation between two individuals. That's the sort of notation you need to kind of remember for these sort of interactions. Now, one thing I do want to talk about is predation can drive coloration in a lot of different ways. And the two basic classifications are: it can produce aposematic coloration, i.e. warning coloration, right? A prey or a predator can show off that don't mess with them by basically being brightly colored, boldly colored, right? And in doing so, they're able to kind of highlight the fact that there's something that is not afraid to stand out. And you see this a lot with toxic creatures, whether it's a poison dart frog with the toxic skin secretions, or something that's venomous like this coral snake right here, this eastern coral snake. In the same token, coloration could also be affected by predation through the need for camouflage or cryptic coloration. So here, for example, are two highly cryptic species. The top picture shows a tree bark, and there's actually a frog resting on the limb that's almost completely blended in with it, and it's kind of an amazing little copse tree frog. And then just below it, you have a mantid that is, a walking stick that is blended in with a mossy tree. So pretty amazing. Both of these types of coloration are pretty amazing. Now, if you have these sort of signals, especially warning coloration out in the environment, you can actually take advantage of this, because if you live in a place where you have species that are showing off their coloration, well, mimicry could be a form of adaptation to avoid predation. So we identify mimicry as two types. Batesian mimicry is when one species that's harmless, right, or harmless, or let's just say highly edible, chooses, i.e. quote unquote quotation, chooses to mimic a species that is more dangerous or maybe distasteful. So here's an example where a hawk moth larva has developed coloration and structures on its hind end to resemble that of the green parrot snake, and they're found in the same environment, and in doing so, creatures, potential predators are going to avoid it because they think they're attacking a snake as opposed to a caterpillar. Another famous example, of course, is the viceroy butterfly, which is mimicking the monarch butterfly. The monarch being a very distasteful butterfly because it's feeding on milkweeds and tends to accumulate the toxins and makes it very unpleasant to eat. So it tends to be avoided by things like birds. And a viceroy butterfly, even though it's a different family of butterflies entirely, just absolutely looks like a monarch, and in doing so, it's pretending it's a monarch, so birds leave it alone. So that's an example of one species mimicking another. Now, in some cases, you may have a whole series of creatures that are harmful, that are essentially resembling each other. And in doing so, they're amplifying the signal, because even though a species may not encounter, say, a bee, it might have encountered a hornet or a wasp, and in having the same type of bright sort of coloration as a group, you're making your presence known at a bigger scale, right? So I can't think of an example that might make this easier concept to understand, except maybe, the idea of getting your name out there. Let's say you're an Instagram influencer and you're just starting out and you don't have a lot of followers. Well, one thing you could do is you can collab with someone that has a lot of followers and get your name out there, right? Kind of the same thing, except this time it's with coloration and being distasteful or harmful. So this type of mimicry that involves more than just one species copying another is called Mullerian mimicry. So anytime you see, black and yellow on an insect, you look twice and you say to yourself, oh, that probably can sting, right? And probably it's either a bee or a hornet or a wasp or something like that, and you want to avoid it. And flies use this too, to their advantage. They can't sting, but they'll pretend they can, right? And in doing so, you just leave the whole group alone. So Batesian, Mullerian mimicry, very, very cool. So here's another example. What type of mimicry is this? And that's me in my younger days, back when ripped jeans were a thing, and then they went away and then they came back. Well, the creature to your right is the eastern coral snake, because black on yellow kills a fellow, and the yellow stripes touch the black part of the snake, and that's an eastern coral snake. So it's a venomous creature. It's got a pretty dangerous venom, and that's actually what I'm handling in that picture right there. But then right beside it, you have a scarlet milk snake. And the scarlet milk snake, notice that the yellow part, which isn't as brightly yellow, is not touching the red part. So black on yellow kills a fellow, red on black, you're okay, Jack. Notice that the red and the black on the coral snake never touch each other, right? Whereas it does on the milk snake. So the milk snake is not venomous. It actually eats venomous snakes, and it's a type of king snake. But by mimicking this pattern, it's able to avoid predation. Right now, a little caveat here: this applies in North America, and that's about it, because there's a lot of different kinds of coral snakes out there, and some of them do look like milk snakes, frankly. So, general rule up here, it applies for the type of snake you would encounter in the woods. Okay, so we don't think of herbivory as predation, but it kind of is like predation, except this time instead of animal on animal, it's plant on plant. And this has been a big driver in plants in terms of defenses, both things like thorns and stuff like that, but also chemical defenses, in the sense of little compounds that are found in plant leaves that make them distasteful or make them outright poisonous and make animals avoid eating them. Right. So again, herbivory is a positive negative. Obviously, the herbivore gets a positive benefit out of eating plants. The plant gets less of a benefit, so it actually gets negatively adapted or negatively affected. Sorry. So it's another example of a positive negative. Now, fun fact: these chemical defenses, not only are they important to the biomedical industry. If you think of most of your pharmaceuticals, they have plant-related compounds that are often the active ingredient in various drugs. And also illicit drugs as well. Often the effects are because it's a plant, right? Whether you're talking about marijuana, whether you're talking about cocaine, heroin is from poppies, right? Opium, but also spices. Spices, things like the spiciness you feel when you bite into a chili pepper. That's actually a chemical defense that the plant thought, anyway, that no one would be interested in. Turns out humans have quite a range of palates, and they're able to feed on things like that. So here's some examples. So we also mentioned the monarch earlier. That's a monarch caterpillar, and it eats milkweeds. And by having that bold coloration, it tells would-be predators that you don't want to bite me because I don't taste good. There's a giraffe feeding on probably an acacia plant, and in feeding on that acacia plant, it could be exposed to thorns and things like that. And then down below, there's an example of an exclosure. So it's not an enclosure, it's an exclosure because you're trying to keep those white snow geese out. And in the tundra, especially along the Hudson's Bay lowlands, where I actually worked for a little while, um, snow geese are being kept away from grazing. And there's so many snow geese that have the populations had like skyrocketed, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s, because of all those corn fields that they feed up on all the way up when they migrate from sort of Texas all the way up into the Arctic. And they get there and then they're ready to breed, and they breed gangbusters, have tons of offspring, and they just basically every year just denude the tundra. So having too many predators can be a problem. When you keep the predators out, notice the green field, it hasn't been grazed. Everything else has turned into muck, right? And that's kind of the negative effect that they're having on the environment. So it can get kind of out of hand if there's not good predation going on and a good balance of nature. So you also have species that often live in very close quarters with each other, right? We don't tend to think of a predator or a herbivore living with with the food that it eats. But symbiosis is, when you have very intimate connection between species. This could be characterized into three different types. There's generally harmful symbiosis, for example, parasitism, which is a positive negative. There are situations where both species can benefit, what they call mutualism, so it's a positive for both, right? So example would be the clownfish and the anemone. The anemone protects the clownfish with its stinging tentacles, and the clownfish eats around the anemone, and all of that debris ends up becoming the food for the anemone. And then you have situations where you could have a benefit for one species and no discernible effect on the other species, a plus zero. Commensalism would be an example of this. It's an interesting case study in not knowing things sometimes. So let's start with parasitism, which makes a lot of sense. Everybody knows what a parasite is, but it's when one species gets nourishment directly from another species, the other species being the host, right? And you could be an ectoparasite, something living on the outside, or an endoparasite, something living on the inside. So onchocerciasis is caused, or otherwise known as river blindness, is caused by a nematode that sets up shop and basically lives inside the eyeball, slowly turning the person blind, right? So that's an example there of an eyeball that has a nematode worm embedded in it, right? So obviously the person is having a negative effect of this parasite, and the parasite benefits. So that's an example of an endoparasite. Another cool example is an isopod that will actually, which is like a small little crustacean that will actually go inside and consume the tongue of a fish, and then sit there and essentially act like the tongue of a fish, and eats the food before the fish gets to eat it. And as a result, slowly the fish dies of starvation, right? So that's an example of a very sinister thing. So those are both, I would consider them endoparasites. I think an ectoparasite example would be something like a mosquito, which everybody knows what a mosquito is and what it does, right? So something like that would be considered ectoparasite, right? Or maybe a tick, right? Or lice or something. And disease, everybody knows what a disease is. You have one organism that's the pathogen that's causing the disease, and it basically is trying to live out its life cycle by using a host to do so, right? So rabies would be an example of this. Rabies, you have, there are often various strains based on the type of intermediate host that it uses. So the rabies virus, for example, will, there's bat versions, there's raccoon rabies, there's fox rabies. And often what will happen is you'll get a spillover effect where that one, host goes out, and instead of infecting another member of its reservoir species, it'll infect something else like a dog or a human, right? So you'll get this communicable disease that's basically like a spillover effect. But the rabies itself is designed to be spread among usually its reservoir host. In both cases, they suppress populations. They often target the weak, the sick, the young, the old, the more susceptible, the ones with lower immune systems. And they can have big effects on populations. It can have big effect on communities, right, of organisms. So again, parasitism would be an example of a positive negative. What about mutualism? So in mutualism, both species benefit. This could be obligate, meaning that it's happening all the time and the species cannot survive without the other. So an example would be a lichen. This is an example of a type of crustose lichen. And lichen are basically the interaction of a fungi and an algae. And those two are now essentially inseparable, right? The fungus breaks down materials and allows nutrients to flow into the algae. The algae is photosynthetic and it'll produce sugars and things, and they both benefit. So lichen are basically two species living together to the point where they're basically a new species. So that's an example of obligate mutualism. Facultative mutualism is similar, except that they're living their own lives, but they both get together every now and then for a mutual benefit. So an example would be this impala here that I saw in Kruger National Park in South Africa that was just completely covered in oxpeckers. And oxpeckers are these birds that have specialized in eating ticks and other ectoparasites off of herding animals. So they'll land on them and they'll feed. And the impala is going to tolerate it because it's basically getting groomed, right? It's getting cleaned of all its parasites. The oxpeckers benefit because they get to eat, right? Now an impala can go out and live its own life. Oxpeckers can go out and live their own life, but they'll get together when necessary to mutual benefit. So mutualism, plus plus. So commensalism. Commensalism happens when one species benefits and the other is either not helped or not harmed in any discernible way. Again, discernible. So we define the interaction as plus/0. It's difficult. It is difficult, but a good chunk of the human population, and some of you hearing this might include you, have mites that live on your hair follicles, including on your eyelids. And they'll bury themselves, like that picture shows, into the hair follicle where it comes out of the skin, and they'll basically feed. They'll feed on dead skin cells. And that's what they look like under a scanning electron microscope, and they look absolutely terrifying, and it's crazy, right? And I bet you that until I told you that you probably had them, you never gave it a thought. And there was no benefit to you, and there was no negative effect to you. Until I told you, you probably just went about your life thinking that you were completely free of anything living on your skin. So that could be an example of commensalism, because you never necessarily had a negative effect. And there's nothing you could do to get rid of them necessarily. They could flare up, but they tend to stick around. We are their habitat. Again, we are their habitat. We're the reason, we're the place that they live. So it's hard to say, right? You see this with some species as well. What about cockroaches? Cockroaches live in people's homes. Are cockroaches necessarily commensals? Well, it depends, right? There's certainly sightly, you don't want them around. There are supposed routes potentially for causing disease, so there could be a negative effect of having cockroaches on you. To be honest, it's been not terribly well proven. In reality, they could carry things, but they're actually infecting humans with those things. It's not very well documented, to be honest. It could be just the stigma of having cockroaches in the first place that underreports it. But either way, these sort of interaction, these sort of commensal interaction, especially between humans, urban areas, and the species that now have gotten really good at living in urban areas, it's often difficult to make that distinction, right? We've become the habitat. The places that have become our habitat, cities in developed areas, are now becoming habitat for other creatures as well. So these sort of interactions might become more common. But what do I know? So another type of interaction is something called facilitation. So anybody that's ever sat through a workshop knows that there's always somebody guiding that workshop, and they often call them the facilitator. And the role of a facilitator is to make it easier for the whatever is the workshop's about to happen, right? So they're there to guide conversations, to challenge the people in the workshop with varying tasks, right? These facilitators. And personally, I hate facilitators. I could never do it myself. I find it very annoying. But I'm glad there are people out there that do it. So a facilitator helps and does this without necessarily directly mentoring and being in contact, just by providing the environment for that. So it could lead to a situation of plus plus, or it could be a plus zero. Who knows? But there isn't a direct contact like you would have with, say, a commensal or something like that. So here's an example of juncus grass. It's a salt grass living in salt marshes. And places that have juncus, right, versus places that don't have juncus. And what do you think's going on here? Take a look at this data. Well, I'll start by saying that this is one of those graphs that doesn't really give you an idea of how much variation there is. It's just kind of a straight up, I'm guessing, an average. But on average, it looks like places, I would imagine these are plots in a salt marsh, places with juncus present have essentially twice as much plant diversity as places without juncus. So what does that mean? Well, it could mean that juncus is doing something to encourage more plants to grow in those areas. So what could those things be? Well, maybe it's better able at altering the soil chemistry to make it more conducive for more plants to take root. It could be that being present allows other plants to somehow rely on the juncus in some other way, whether it's for shade, or maybe plants growing on it, or maybe it helps to mobilize the salt in some way. But whatever it is, having it present will increase diversity. So juncus is acting like the facilitator in this case. It's making it easier for other plants to take root in these environments. So here's another example. This is Pisaster. Pisaster is a starfish, a sea star. And this is showing, again, same type of graph, right? Number of species across years, and there's an experiment being done here. So what do you think is going on here, and what can we say about Pisaster? Okay, so obviously this experiment started in the 60s, and there's an experimental and there's a control. The control seems to have the starfish present, whereas in the experimental, I guess they went through and removed the sea star. And then they watched changes in biodiversity over time, right? The number of species present. And evidently, they started this project, it looks like 1963, and by 1966 you saw a difference in the number of species present, with the ones that have Pisaster starfish present having essentially no real change in the number of species found in those areas, whereas the ones where Pisaster was removed saw a complete drop in biodiversity. And that maintained for the years up until a decade later in 1973. So what might be going on here? Well, the picture at the top kind of lays a little bit of information. Starfish, they're one of the world's slowest predators, but they're still a predator, and they're out there, consuming things like mollusks and barnacles, stuff like that. And these starfish were basically being present. They were able to keep the number of I believe it was mussels, uh, down. And in doing so, they were basically keeping the mussels from basically consuming everything in terms of filter feeding, like they do, and also would go after things like sea urchins and stuff. So they were kind of like the, let's just say, a dominant predator in that ecosystem. And by being there, they would be able to keep the herbivores, quote unquote, the things that consume other things, low. But when you remove them, all of those other things are going to grow. So the possessor is an example of a keystone species, a species that exerts an effect on its environment that's very, very strong, i.e., it's sort of vastly disproportional to the number of the species being present. So keystone is named for the keystone in an arch. So if you ever try to make an arch, you'll know that you need this one stone in the middle that balances all the other ones out, or else the whole thing collapses. That's a keystone. So that keystone is the most important stone in this case because it keeps the whole arch together. And keystone species are no different. So even though they're not the most common thing in the environment, they're having an effect that strongly impacts the health of the entire ecosystem. So what are some examples of this? Well, an example would be sea otters. So sea otters are, obviously they're otters. Obviously they live in the sea, and sea otters, they live in the Pacific coast. They live specifically, they're found in kelp forest habitats. So kelp is some of the fastest growing plants on the planet. Actually, they're not even a plant. They're technically an algae, and they're growing like crazy all the time. And in those forest environments, they're very biodiverse. Now, the sea otter also has a nice waterproof coat, which made it very fashionable for the fur trade. And that's why when humans, with their westward expansion, found these sea otters, they were very quick to essentially slaughter them. And for a while, they were very, very rare. Right? They're still not terribly abundant. But with the removal of the sea otter, you saw this cascading effect where kelp forests started to decline. And it took a while to figure out that the reason that the kelp forests declined is because they were being predated on by sea urchins. Now, kelp are very, very tall. They're some of the tallest organisms out there. But they attach to the bottom with something called the holdfast. And the holdfast is just kind of like some stalks that are stuck on the substrate below. And sea urchin would target these holdfasts and eat them. And in doing so, they basically would destroy the kelp. The kelp would just be set free and disappear. So entire kelp forest would be ruined by having sea urchins out of control because the sea otter was the keystone species that kept their populations in check. So an example where the removal of one species has a cascading effect on the entire ecosystem. As the kelp forest vanished, fisheries started to collapse, less diversity of all sorts of things, from birds to sharks to fish and other crustaceans and things like this. So a big cascading effect. Even though sea otters weren't the most common thing, they were still playing this very big role. Now, another way you can be a very important keystone is to be something that creates a new ecosystem. Now, I'm Canadian, so I have to give a shout out to the Canadian beaver. And beavers, as you know, they build beaver dams. Basically, they block rivers and streams, and they do what dams do. They block it, and then they create a reservoir behind them, and they create beaver ponds. So beavers have a very big effect because anywhere beavers are found, they create these dams. They're basically creating whole new ponds, whole new lakes, whole new water bodies, which then benefits a whole range of species, from waterfowl to fish to moose, which like to feed on them, right? So they have this very big effect on the ecosystem, right? So they're ecosystem engineers. We are also an ecosystem engineer, although our ecosystems are kind of lame compared to what beavers can produce, if you ask me. But by making changes in the environment, actual physical changes, and altering the habitats, you're altering the communities that live there. So let's talk a little bit about biodiversity now. All of these keystone species are trying to increase biodiversity. And when we talk about biodiversity, there's different ways we can define it. This is a world map showing what they call the biodiversity hotspots, at least on land anyway. These are places that have unique fauna, unique flora that are found nowhere else. And the idea is that by protecting these areas, we can protect a good chunk of diversity that's out there. So these are places that have a lot of endemic species. They are places that have a lot of species in general, and they're places that are unique in some way. So just kind of give you an idea. These are the kind of places I like to travel to because I like to see wild things and wild places. So I like to see unique places. So all of that is here. So what does biodiversity mean? At its simplest, we often talk about species diversity, but that's only a part of it. So here are three biodiverse sort of definitions. The first is you could look at the genetic diversity. You take a population of creatures and you look at, okay, how much genetic variation is there in this population in this area, right? So that's the first sort of level of biodiversity. The second level is what we tend to think of species, right? So if you look at a redwood forest would have a whole bunch of different species in there, including these voles, for example. They're basically like mice, but with short tails. Um, and each of those mice has their own genetics. So the genetic diversity is sort of folded into the species diversity. So this is a particular habitat, the coastal redwood forest, a particular ecosystem. Now, if you were to protect an area, a region, let's say coastal California, you decide to make a giant park like, I don't know, like Redwood Forest or Big Sur or something, within that environment, you'd have different habitats, different ecosystems, different communities. So you would have all these environments inside the same region. Well, that's another sort of measure of biodiversity, right? You often see this when if you go to a national park. You go to a national park and you get the little pamphlet. It's got the black banner on the side. It tells you what the park is. And you open it up and there's always a map of the park. So it tells you where the trails and the campgrounds are. But then there's also this picture that shows all the different environments and all the different creatures that live in this environment, right? So even in a place like, say, the Everglades, for example, close to home, well, you have the sort of the marshy, sort of open prairie like Everglades, but then you also have these pockets of cypress forest and then coastal mangrove forests. And all of these are different ecosystems that are all live within the region of the Everglades. So again, all of those are going to have their own species, so diversity. The goal in the end is to preserve as much diversity as possible, often with very limited means. So here's an example of two communities. You have community one, you have community two. Which one's more diverse? I'm sure most of you hopefully picked community one. Now, if you look closely at community one, there are 4 species of trees. So this forest is made up of these 4 species. But if you look closely at community two, you'll find that those 4 species are also present. So if you were to go strictly on the basis of what we call species richness, the number of species in a community, both community 1 and community 2 would be equal because they both have those same 4 species of tree. But it's pretty obvious that community 2 is primarily dominated by the tree that's marked as A, right? So you have a particularly dominant species, but other ones also inhabiting. The community 1, on the other hand, you see a more even distribution of each of the different species. So all of them are kind of doing equally well, so to speak. Not any one is dominating the other. So community 1 would be the more diverse, but obviously it takes a little more than just how many species you have to get that qualification. Now, dominant species, these are the ones that that obviously dominate an area. They're usually the most abundant. They usually account for the majority, and they usually define the nature of these places. So, for example, if you look at the northern forests, right, so these are the so-called boreal forests of North America as well as Eurasia, you see that they're dominated by particular species. So in the case of North America, the predominant tree are spruce trees, a few pines, a few other things, but spruce accounts for the majority of the trees. In Eurasia, you have larch trees that tend to be the ones that dominate. But in both cases, you have these trees that, for whatever reason, they're very, very successful, right? Could be because they breed the fastest. It could be because the soil is perfect. It could be that they're just really good at excluding their competitors, right? So boreal forests are dominated really by a couple of species of trees. So even though these are the largest forests by area, we often talk about the Amazon just because the Amazon has a high diversity of species as opposed to these forests. So when we talk about biodiversity, we're often concerned about what happens to them. Now, habitats, when they get disturbed, what do they do for biodiversity? So here's a wildfire ripping through, I believe this is Australia. So what does a fire do to biodiversity? Well, depends on the scale. So a thing to remember is that a disturbance, what it does is it alters the landscape either by removing aspects of the community, so it could be just burning plants, or it could be changing the resources of a community. It could be introducing a new resource, right? So like a flood, for example, could introduce all these new resources, right? So all these disturbances are happening, and they happen at varying levels of frequency. An important thing to remember is that in nature, things are not in equilibrium, and if they are, it won't last. Things are always changing, sometimes good, sometimes bad. When we do it, often it's considered bad because we're doing it in a very unnatural sort of way, right? Trees do fall down in the forest all the time, but when we do it, we cut down large tracts of trees over and over, targeting the biggest ones that are often the strongest and healthiest ones. Very different how nature acts, right? So we do things in very different ways. So here, for example, is a patch of the Amazon. This is one of the many projects where they are doing fragmentation studies, looking at how varying size patches of rainforests and the effects they have on diversity. Right, there's a long ongoing study there, BNF study, and it's exactly it. They're interested in the effects on biodiversity of logging, which is happening in the Amazon all the time. So, the question is, when you disturb the habitat, how does it work? Well, we tend to think of it as being negative, but our approach has sort of changed, and now we accept something called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which aims to address the effects of disturbance on biodiversity. So here's a burned out forest, and it's just recently burned, almost no vegetation on the ground. What happens next? Well, plants will eventually come back, right? So here you have all these beautiful wildflowers that are growing up out of the soil, right? And what we tend to think of with the intermediate disturbance hypothesis is disturbance can be good for biodiversity, but it depends. So here's a graph showing the intensity of disturbance against the number of species or taxa biodiversity. So what is it suggesting here, this graph? Well, I'll start by saying that the points are not necessarily, it's not the cleanest graph in terms of the relationship, but you do have a trend line there which fits the pattern of points. But basically what it's saying is that very high levels of disturbance, you have very low biodiversity, because there's a lot of disturbance happening all the time new species cannot come in and get established. If you have very low amounts of disturbance, you also similarly have fewer numbers of species. And the reason being because low levels of disturbance means that you have an environment that stagnates, an environment where things are starting to be set in their ways. Competitive exclusion has worked and kicked out species. It's not what we call dynamic, it's a static environment. However, if you have an occasional disturbance here and there that alters the environment, well, that gives a chance for the environment to be recolonized. It gives a chance for the environment to have different types of habitats as opposed to being dominated by just the one dominant habitat. New species can come in, even if temporarily, and what you'll end up with is a higher amount of diversity. So an intermediate disturbance regime is best for biodiversity. And a lot of this is dependent on this idea of ecological succession. When disturbance happens, which again is normal, right? Flooding is normal. Trees falling down is normal. Forest fires are normal. Earthquakes are normal, right? These are normal things that happen. And when they do happen, nature comes back and bounces back, right? So the order with which a community recovers is succession. And we identify two types. There's primary succession. So this is the type of situation would happen when there's not even any soil. It's like barren rock. And you have the beginning of colonization, usually through lichen, and then eventually turning it into grassland and other plants. And then it starts to recover. So think, for example, about Hawaii. Hawaii volcanoes erupt, they lay out lava rock, and then specialized plants and things start growing on the lava rock itself, and eventually it will turn it into the lush, forested Hawaii that we all know and love and want to visit. Secondary succession happens when there is a bit of soil, but the community recovers after a disturbance. And usually we think of this as being like an open field, for example, where you start getting some small shrubs starting to grow, and eventually that field will become a tree or become a forest with trees. This will happen as long as no disturbance happens in the way. Now, the reason we have prairies in the middle of the North American continent is because we used to have a lot more fires, and we used to have a lot of herbivores, right? Bison in particular, that would roam through the prairie and consume the grasses, and in doing so they would change the soil chemistry and they would compact the soil and make it harder for trees to grow. So because they lived in those areas, you had a very different environment. As soon as they left quote unquote, because humans decided they needed to leave, as soon as they were out of the environment in large numbers, you start seeing places where the succession starts happening, right? Unless those places were plowed down and turned into farmers' fields. So you actually saw a compression of prairie habitat, grassland habitat, an inclusion of forest habitats. And nowadays, if you want to maintain prairie, you have to essentially conduct a controlled burn every now and then to keep that succession process happening. So let's talk about species diversity now. Small populations. So when you have a small population, they're unsustainable in the long term. Why is that? And while we're at it, let's talk about genetic diversity. Why do you want to have a high genetic diversity in a population? And then, should species that are not genetically pure be preserved? So what do I mean by that? Sounds very suspect, right? This is the red wolf. Red wolf, the American red wolf, it's found in the southeast. It's a species that has, basically their numbers plummeted to it's estimated about 20 or so wild individuals. They live in one refuge in North Carolina. There's a few captives, a couple of extra populations here and there of very few animals. And they are a species that is a subject of a lot of controversy. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife is trying to bring them back through captive breeding. But while they're doing this, they're facing an uphill battle because, like dogs in general, they tend to be very genetically malleable. And one of the things that happens is you have coyotes inhabiting the area increasingly, and you're seeing a lot of coyote genes entering into these populations of red wolves. So there's a big question about whether or not they're even a species anymore, or whether they're just some sort of weird hybrid with the gray wolf, which is the other main wolf that people tend to think about. So should they be preserved if they're not genetically pure? Depends, right? So small populations are unsustainable. Obviously, if you have a small population, it's more more susceptible to bad things happening, events, being wiped out by a flood, especially overall in one area, or wiped out in a fire. You also have a problem with genetics, right? Small populations means that you end up experiencing inbreeding. Inbreeding can lead to all sorts of problems down the line. So that's why maintaining a high genetic diversity is particularly important in order to sort of stave off the effects of the inbreeding. And this is more of an ethical question about the genetically pure. It really depends on your viewpoint, right? We do live in a world with limited financial resource that we have to do conservation with, so it could be an important feature. But again, it's an ethical question. It's sort of a personal question. So when we talk about conservation, unfortunately, we don't know how to do it very well, especially with animal conservation. We have a hard time. Because often when we want to start conserving things in the past, we would start when they became rare, right? We always heard about endangered species, right? And often it's very hard to bring a species back when the population gets really small. So the California condor, for example, shown here, it's got a little wing tag. And these animals, they were the subject of a very intense captive breeding program. They released a few of them here and there, mixed success. Their populations were essentially very, very tiny by the time conservation started on them, right? So they've had a hard sort of road getting back. You can still find wild condors in certain places, but we know just about all of them, where they are. So a lot of hard work, a lot of money, a lot of time. In contrast, Florida scrub jays, this population was doing fine, but was starting to decline. So the intervention with Florida scrub jays happened a lot earlier. Florida scrub jays inhabit sort of the central spine of Florida, if you will, so sort of the drier, non-coastal places. And it's in those places, those type of habitats where they were quickly identified, a lot of them were preserved, and because that intervention happened a lot earlier, they tend to have a more stable population and are even starting to increase in certain places, right? So the intervention happened a lot earlier. They didn't wait until there were like only 20 Florida scrub jays before they did anything. So it's usually best to start when you have a declining population, intervening early. I feel that makes a lot of sense intuitively. Unfortunately, it hasn't been the reality for us. So the one way to sort of assess population size and what you need is to calculate the MVP, not the most valuable player, but the minimum viable population. This is the smallest population that you can have and still expect the species to survive under ideal conditions, right? And one way to figure out the MVP, which is essentially a sort of an abstract idea, is to calculate something called the effective population size, which is based on the ability of a population to breed. So just quickly, here's the equation, which is basically knowing the number of males and the number of females that are going to breed successfully. And by applying this equation, it'll give you an idea of the breeding potential, right, to calculate the effective population size. So how small is too small to start intervening to save creatures? Well, it depends on a lot of things. But when you get to a small population, you start to see the effects that will further dwindle your population. So ideally, you start early. Now, a small population leads to inbreeding. That erodes your genetic variability. It makes offspring that are often more prone to rare diseases. It makes offspring that are often forced to breed with similar related species or similar related individuals. And this could decrease their fitness, their ability to reproduce, and you end up with this essentially vortex of negative that makes your population go from small to even smaller. We know about genetic drift. Genetic drift, again, it's something random that can happen that can decrease the genetic variation in a population. That'll further spiral this whole thing. So you end up with a population that's small that then starts reproducing less, even though they're supposed to be reproducing more. You start seeing them die more often, even though they should be trying to stay alive. And then your small population gets smaller and smaller until it vortexes into extinction. These are Saiga antelope. They're a very cool antelope species that went through a big genetic bottleneck in some places because of a respiratory disease that went through and wiped out a good chunk of their population. So they were left with going from a large population to a small population. That was an example of genetic drift. And now that population is, they're trying to bring it back. Very valiant efforts, making some successes. But you also have some populations that just got small enough that they're just undergoing this vortex of extinction. And it's unfortunate because I think it's one of the coolest animals out there. They're found in places like Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Russia. These are adapted to sort of the open Eurasian steppe or the open Eurasian prairies. And they're a very cool animal with a very large bulbous nose. I guess it kind of makes sense that a respiratory illness would get them with that kind of nose. But either way, hopefully they'll do all right in the future. I'd love to see them. So if you want to do conservation and you want to protect the landscape, how the landscape looks is very important. So landscapes that are really fragmented can create a lot of problems for you. One is by having these edges, you have isolation. So the species that inhabit a small little patch of habitat are going to have a hard time connecting with others. So you're basically limiting your population to small little units. So connecting them is important. But you also have this extra effect where you have a habitat that interacts with another habitat or the habitat edge. Well, you can get some problems there. Now, on the first thought, I was just telling you about ecosystem diversity and habitat diversity and community diversity. And I also told you that having some disturbance is good for biodiversity. So if that's all the case, then how come habitat edges can be a problem? Well, it has to do with what diversity you're trying to protect and how big your little patch can be. Because if you have too small a patch, then what will end up happening is it might not be enough to protect the species. So if you have, say, small little patches of forest surrounded by large expanse of field, where those fields will have their own species, well, they're going to start to use that forest environment, and they're going to start, and the forest creatures are going to start to leave, if they can leave, because they want to connect with others of their species and find larger areas of habitat. So you're going to get a declining population of one thing and an intrusion from the edges. And this could especially be problematic if you're dealing with, say, invasive species. So whenever you have small patches in a landscape, it helps to connect them somehow. So providing some sort of corridor is an important thing. So here's a corridor. It's a famous corridor along the highways that run through Banff National Park in Canada. So grizzly bears, moose, elk, bighorn sheep, all these animals are moving over the highway. There's fences that basically guide them towards these bridges, and by doing so, it limits the number of them colliding with cars, which is a great thing. If you go to the tropics, you see the same thing. In Costa Rica, they have these little cable runways, if you will, with a little netting over the canopy, connecting forests over the road, right? So something like a capuchin monkey, like you see here, looks like it's carrying a baby on its back, can go from one forest patch to another. So what does this do for the population of animals living in a patch? Well, it connects them, so it makes the population bigger, right? And these sort of patches, or these sort of relationship between patches of habitat are becoming increasingly important because the world is starting to look a little more like that. So they say that the worst thing you can do to a wilderness is make a road. So here's a wilderness area, and there's a little road or a little entrance way leading to some field station or camp or something in this particular picture, right? This can be a problem because as soon as there's access, you're going to get an effect of that access. As soon as you have a road, people can get in there and start to use it. People can get in there and start to extract resources. People can get in there and start to build. People can get in there and start to disturb. And then you start getting this concentric effect on the environment just from a single road. So they say it's the absolute worst thing to do is to build a road. The best wildernesses in the world are the ones that are completely cut off from anybody because, frankly, we can't be trusted. So if we want to make a national park, what are some of the things we would need to consider? Well, landscape, size, how much habitat, what types of habitat, minimizing human interference, a whole bunch of things, right? And especially a good thing to think about is how that park fits into the bigger picture of the other parks that are out there. So here's a picture of Costa Rica. Costa Rica uses something called the zone reserve model. Basically, they have national parks, which are shown here in green all over the country. Costa Rica is a biodiversity hotspot. It's also a very popular place. Most people's first rainforest they ever see is in Costa Rica because it's a place that really has gone into the ecotourism industry in a big way. It was also helped by the fact that it got these grants to support conservation. And in doing so, they were able to establish a lot of these national parks and develop an industry that's not trying to be copied in other places. Fun fact, as a condition of getting those grants, they had to completely abandon their military. So they don't have a military per se. They have police force, but they don't have military. So they basically devoted the money that they would devote to an armed force to conservation instead. But they are contractually protected by the U.S., which wouldn't let anything happen in that part of the world, I guess, unless they're having a hand in it. But that's just me. But anyway, you have these national parks, and they're connected to each other through these buffers. And basically in these buffers, there's a limit on what can be done. Limited agriculture, limited resource extraction, limited hunting. And this basically allows the animals to go from protected area to protected area with a certain level of protection. So this is a sort of reserve approach we need to have if we're trying to preserve creatures in human-dominated places, right? Places where there's a lot of people. Because this gives, sort of more undisturbed places a chance to not be affected by the edge habitat. In contrast, here is, I think this is Amboseli National Park in Kenya, and right up to it is agriculture. So you've got the tropical savanna of Africa, the savanna where all the animals are, and then you have essentially agriculture right up to the end. So right there you have pesticide use, fertilizer use, hunting, humans, all of that right there. And there's no buffer, right? The wild animals of the national park cannot make their way into, cannot cross all that to get to where they need to go, right? So that's an example of what it would look like without a buffer. So a zone reserve is a good idea. We try to do that here too. And in having a zone reserve, what you basically do is you increase your populations. You connect populations that otherwise wouldn't be connected. So Yellowstone, in sort of where Idaho and Montana and Wyoming meet, and then you have Grand Teton National Park. It's a close by national park. And basically by having a buffer zone that allows essentially no hunting, you are basically establishing a larger area for which creatures to survive. So here's grizzly bear data. So the minimum viable population for a small area encompassing pretty much only those national parks would be 50 individuals. But by having an area that's buffered protection where no hunting is allowed outside of the park, it's basically now expanded to 500 individuals that the environment can support, right? And again, these aren't areas that are protected, they're just regulated in certain ways. There's still people living there. People live right up to Yellowstone. but there's only a limited number of things that they can do with the environment. So overall, a very good approach that has a big effect on the populations of animals you're trying to protect. So what's our bioremediation? Well, if humans make a point of it, they can bring back a landscape quite well, right? If it becomes a priority. So here's a gravel mine in New Jersey in the early 90s, and by the turn of the century, you have a nice field. You would never have known that that was a gravel mine, right? So an example of a well-restored bioremediation. And bioremediation, aside from just restoring back the habitat, also seeks to fix things that might potentially be harmful, the effects of humans being there. So often we'll talk about bioremediation in the context of detoxification. So mining, for example, can introduce a whole bunch of new, hazardous toxins, minerals, compounds into the environment that shouldn't be there, or maybe not there in those kind of levels. So by using living organisms, we can detoxify environments. So what can we do? Well, we can use bacteria, like for example, oil breaking down bacteria that everybody wants to use for oil spills. Fungi, which help to break down solid things. Plants, which can help to uptake metals, for example, like heavy metals can be taken up by certain grasses, and by doing so, they get out of the environment and they're in the plant and they're not in the soil, being part of the ecosystem. So they can absorb it. In some cases, you could find creatures that could actually break down things, right? So, like again, those oil digesting bacterias, how great would those be, right? They can break down fossil fuels into something else that's more natural, right? Again, this is an area that is, I think, increasingly important. This is an example of, I think this is agricultural runoff, and they produced a sort of they basically lined it so that the water doesn't get out, and then in doing so, they're basically bringing it back with plants that are soaking up the heavy metals left over by some sort of operation. So biological augmentation is kind of similar, but here it's when you have an environment that the problem is not removing things from the environment. The problem is introducing things into the environment that are necessary for a healthy ecosystem. So you're using organisms to bring back materials, bring back minerals, nutrients to an environment. So in the case of Florida on the coast, our sand dunes through human alterations on the coast, the destruction of barrier islands, the removal of mangrove forests, building on these barrier islands that are basically just glorified sandbars. We've removed a lot of the native plants, and as such, with those plants, we're fixing nitrogen. Again, nitrogen is everywhere in the sky, in the atmosphere. It's the main part of the atmosphere, the main part of air, the main component. But that is a type of nitrogen that can't be used. It has to be fixed by bacteria and plants. And by introducing plants that can fix the bacteria, that can fix the nitrogen, you're introducing nitrogen into otherwise depleted environments and thus encouraging ecosystems to recover. Right? So there's a big push now in a lot of places in Florida to restore the dunes, in part to prevent sort of storm surge in a better way, right? And to also bring back certain species, sea turtles and a lot of plovers and sandpipers. So they want to bring back these species by restoring dune habitats that have been destroyed for human developments and beach use, right? So nitrogen fixing plants could be doing this. So an example of biological augmentation. You're augmenting a biological component of the environment. So restoration ecology matters, and it matters a lot, and it matters a lot to Florida, because Florida is probably more than any other place in the US defined by the interaction of humans and nature. Florida was a very different place long ago. It was a place that we all know the Florida look, right? Tall trees, fresh water, swamps, a diversity of species often found nowhere else, and the healthy ecosystems of Florida have been manipulated. And nowhere is this more evident than the Everglades. So just a quick thing, the Everglades is a river. And what I mean by that is you have a flow of water that goes from one place to another very, very slowly. It's happening so slowly, about 2 meters per hour, that the average person can't tell it's a river. They call it the Sea of Grass or the River of Grass. River of Grass makes more sense. Naturally, the way the Everglades worked in South Florida is you had the Kissimmee River. The Kissimmee River has a watershed, and whenever the rainy season would come, the Kissimmee River would swell and dump into Lake Okeechobee. Lake Okeechobee would flood its banks, and the water would be basically pushed over, and it would flow south towards the sea. And that's what it shows here, the natural flow of water, the flood waters that every year would make their way from Lake Okeechobee to the coast through what is now the Everglades. But agriculture came to Florida. South Florida basically sought to minimize this flow to prevent flood, right? To allow for development and also to channelize the water in a way that would benefit agriculture. So you had a system of canals that were built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they basically stopped the seasonal flooding of the water. And by stopping the seasonal flooding of the water, they allowed agriculture to happen. They built giant dikes and levees to control water so that development can happen, that allow the development of places like Miami and that whole shoreline. And it cut the flow through the Everglades. So the Everglades is a river that got essentially, for all intents and purposes, dammed. And the flow now is very, very, very minimal, and it's only because of advocacy that it's even happening. And that little bit of water makes its way through the park that is now Everglades National Park. But the Everglades as an ecosystem was much bigger than the park. So now they want to restore this water flow. They want to bring back the flow of water to the Everglades. They want to basically do this by opening up canals and rerouting water at an earlier point, and thus allow for that environment to come back up. This is an expensive proposition. At the time it was $4 billion, who knows what it is now, to make this area recover. And the big issue is not about conservation, but more about restoring the natural flow with which water can leave South Florida. Getting increasingly hit by hurricanes, increasingly concerned about seasonal changes in water, and concerns about salt water entering into the Florida aquifer and affecting drinking water. All of these are realistic concerns. And because of those concerns, this idea that we have to restore this flow as a way for water to leave the land and get back to the ocean is necessary, right? So trying to minimize inland flooding. Plus, agriculture is becoming increasingly difficult to do in South Florida. A lot of places, just because of seasonal flooding, saltwater intrusion, and in general, the higher temperatures, longer droughts, is affecting agriculture in a lot of places, especially in the South. So those places aren't being as productive as they have been in the past anyway. So by doing this, restoring this environment, perhaps we can bring it back to something that resembled old Florida.